This is Treks to Nowhere. Superlatives. A superlative is an adjective used to describe something of the highest kind, quality, or order, surpassing all else or others, supreme, extreme, most outstanding, one of a kind, as it were. Now, as humans, we are absolutely yet somehow inexplicably drawn to superlatives, whether it's simple curiosity or intrigue, or rather tied somehow to our inherent competitive natures. We cannot deny that there is something fundamentally alluring about extreme or singularly unique places and things. Now, when it comes to geography and, of course, geographical oddities, superlatives are quite prevalent and can be divided into what I think are many subcategories. For example, let's start with cardinal superlatives. I would define a cardinal superlative as those places that exist at the extreme edges of a defined place. More specifically, these would typically be places like the northernmost or easternmost point of a certain, say, country or state. Now, these types of places are often well known, identified on maps, and possibly even well marked with an obvious physical indicator. Now, one specific personal example of a cardinal superlative is a place called Quoddy Head State Park in Maine. During a road trip back in 2002, I drove to the eastern states and eastern provinces of Canada. On that trip, I visited the easternmost point of the United States at Quoddy Head State Park in Maine. And what's more is even when I got there and I stood at the lighthouse marking the easternmost point, I looked off to the distance and saw that if I were to just hop the fence, that I could actually hike out a little bit further to the farthest possible accessible rock before the ocean. And of course, I did just that because I wanted to be able to say that I was the farthest point east in the United States, and every other human being that existed within the United States at that moment was west of me. Another great example is in the summer of 2001, so going way back, I visited Key West, Florida, and as part of that trip, I made a point to go out to the marker indicating the southernmost point of the contiguous United States. And lastly, another great example is when I talked about my trip to Iceland and when I went up to the Arctic Circle on the island of Grimsey, before making that trip, I actually visited the northernmost point on mainland Iceland, a place called Rifstangi. Now, obviously, the ultimate example of a cardinal superlative for me would be my trip to South Pole Station, where I stood at 90 degrees south and every other human being, alive or dead, was north of me. Now, on many occasions, I have seeked out or traveled to cardinal superlatives of various states, provinces, or even countries. For example, in 2019, as part of an Antarctic expedition on a drilling vessel, we traversed around the southern tip of South America. And on that traverse, I was able to witness the southern tip of a small island called Isla Hornos, which marks the southernmost point in South America. And while I didn't actually get to see the point up close and personal, I was able to photograph it from afar and see that precise point of land marking that southernmost point. Now, the next type of superlative that I would categorize would be altitudinal, and this, of course, would include depth as well. So these would be things like the highest peak or the lowest point, or even the deepest point in the ocean, such as Challenger Deep. So examples of this would be places like the Badwater Basin in the United States, which is over 200 feet below sea level, or Mount Everest, which is the highest point on Earth. So on many of my treks to nowhere, I've specifically seeked out these altitudinal superlatives, particularly when it comes to high mountain peaks. Now, a very large number of people throughout history are drawn to these types of superlatives, thinking specifically of the mighty Mount Everest, right? Or simply the highest peak in a given country or state. There's just something special about tagging or peak bagging that is just really satisfying. And I suppose there must be, given that thousands of people each year summit Mount Everest and summit Denali and summit Kilimanjaro and countless other significant peaks all around the world. Now, here in the United States, there's actually an organization called the High Pointers Club, whose sole purpose is to promote and celebrate the hiking of all 50 state high points, including the ridiculously silly ones like Florida or Delaware that are only a few hundred feet above sea level. Now, this organization even sends out monthly newsletters and magazine mailings with featured stories centered on completers, or those that have completed all 50 state high points. Now, I myself have been on a multi-year quest to not only visit all 50 state high points, but also all 58 of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks. Now, one example that sticks out is during my 2010 Pacific Crest Trail thru hike, I specifically made sure to take a day-long detour off the trail just so that I could summit California's Mount Whitney, so that I could essentially visit the highest point in the contiguous 48, but also so I could check off one of the 50 state high points. So the next type of superlative that I would categorize would be temporal superlatives, and these would be all the firsts. And it's really the principal driver for a lot of explorers. So the first to the pole, the first to the moon, the first to summit a specific peak or visit a specific area. And I think this also plays in many instances to someone being, say, the youngest or the oldest to complete something, right? So how many times have you recalled reading a story about the oldest person to summit such and such peak, or the youngest finisher at a well-known race or event? I mean, even just today, I read an article about an 8-year-old boy climbing El Capitan in Yosemite, the youngest to ever do so. So there's, again, just something very alluring about standing out, holding a record of some kind, and having your name forever written in the annals of history, even if only temporarily. Heck, even I've gone after such records. Certainly I've talked about my notable achievement of being the first to the South Pole in 2016, but I've even also gone out to try various speed record attempts. Specifically, I'm recalling my Vermont Long Trail unsupported speed record attempt, even though it ultimately was unsuccessful. So this is a great segue into the next type of superlative that I would label record superlatives. So this would be anything that's sort of a fastest known time, or the fastest to complete a specific event, or hike the Appalachian Trail, or complete all of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks. So really, in a sense, it plays as a motivation for any speed record involving any sort of geographical feature for any event, really. So in a sense, every Olympic gold medal that's on any sort of natural course is essentially a record superlative. Now, as a side note, there is a social media fitness app called Strava, where people can log their various workouts on foot or on wheels. And at the very heart of this app are what are called segments. Now, these segments provide a way to essentially gamify your workouts by letting random strangers compete, but for the fastest time completing that small portion of road or trail that you've identified as your segment. So no matter how seemingly random or obscure that segment is, you can, in theory, compete against someone else for the record time on it. Now, there's something weirdly exhilarating about that, about racing an invisible foe down a remote and arbitrary stretch of trail deep in the woods of, say, Vermont. I can recall instances where I ran so hard I nearly passed out, just for the privilege of being able to say, even for just a short period of time, that I hold the record for this small half-mile stretch of trail tucked away in the middle of the woods that really no one else cares about except for me and those random 2 other people on Strava. And then, inevitably, sometime later, I would get that dreaded email from Strava that said something like, "Hey, someone has recently surpassed your record. Are you just going to sit by and let them take your record away from you? It's time to get off your butt, get back out there, and retake your record." And as stupid as it sounds, it would often work, and I'd be out there the very next day running even harder, trying to get my segment record back. Why? Why do we do these silly things? I'm not entirely sure I can explain it. I just know there's something truly exhilarating about it. So moving on to the next type of superlative, I would categorize them as spatial or extreme superlatives. And what I mean is these would be places like the smallest island or the largest exclave or the largest meander bend in a river or the biggest canyon. So very much a spatial size superlative, whether that's large or very small. And in many ways, the terminus points of a long distance trail are also sort of a spatial superlative. So if you think about the Appalachian Trail, for example, the northern and southern terminus, in a sense, are the extreme points of this trail. Now, I can think about many instances in the past where I've been motivated explicitly by this type of superlative. So for example, when I was on a road trip to Alaska, I made a concerted effort to drive the entire length of the Alaskan Highway, all the way from Dawson Creek, British Columbia, up to the Delta Junction in Alaska, making sure to photograph the very first mile marker as well as the very last mile marker. And there's just something about it, wanting to cover the entire distance. And this is a huge motivation behind through hikes as well. So every time I've done a major through hike, I really want to focus on both that starting point and the end point. But even putting those sort of obvious examples aside, I think about all the times that I'm out on a hike, particularly if it's like a looped hike, or if I'm on a trail race or trail run, and I know that the course features some kind of out and back or loop. There's inevitably a point during that race where I will be on the far turnaround point or the far end of the loop, and I will think to myself, I am at the extreme point of this course, and every step I now take following this moment will be a step closer back to my starting point. And so there's just something about identifying that point, wherever it is, in whatever event it is, that's the farthest point out, that is just very exhilarating and very satisfying to me, which I think kind of taps into sort of an emotional connection to superlatives, which leads perfectly into the last type of superlative that I would define as subjective superlatives. And these are the type of superlatives that are really all about the sort of feelings they evoke. So these are the places that I would call the most remote or the most isolated. There's not really a specific way to define what is most remote or what is most isolated, although I suppose that could be argued. But my point is that it's all about the feeling. There's that place in the middle of the woods that, to me, I would define as the most remote or the most isolated, but maybe not everyone would. I would say of all the superlatives that I've mentioned, though, these are actually the ones where I most align, and they act as sort of the primary motivation for so much of what I do and for these types of videos and my treks to nowhere. These are the places in all of my travels that evoke the most acute and poignant of feelings within me and really serve to drive that passion and get me out there trying to find these unique places. Now, throughout history, this tug to the superlatives is quite prevalent. I mean, the quote at the very start of the companion text that I'm writing for Treks to Nowhere is a quote taken directly from Moby Dick, where Melville writes, "As for me, I am tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote." Now, if you think about the countless explorers throughout history, or your favorite episode of Rick Steves on NPR, or perhaps the most engaging travel show on television, there are likely countless examples of people seeking out these types of superlatives. It's in our nature. It's who we are. It's what defines us. So, with that said, many of my own treks to nowhere are most certainly motivated by this same pull. Now, one example of such a trek would be that of my little adventure out to Cockle Creek and the South Cape Bay of Australia. In March of 2016, I had just returned from my first deployment to South Pole Station, only to find myself on another plane a month and a half later to head right back to Southern Australia. I had been invited to a conference to present results from various ice coring projects I had worked on over the years, including South Pole. Now, needless to say, heading back to the Southern Hemisphere for this meeting was something that I had been looking forward to for quite some time. And while I may not have been thrilled with the prospect of another 14-hour Trans-Pacific flight, I was ecstatic to finally be visiting a place that I'd had on my wish list for quite some time: Tasmania. Now, every evening after the last conference sessions came to an end and the daily diaspora of researchers all made their way to various dining establishments or watering holes, I would generally spend most of my free time thrashing around in the nature preserve up behind my cozy bed and breakfast. Now, when I wasn't busy playing around in the preserve, I would often take on the sort of loftier challenge of trying to complete full ascents of Mount Wellington, which is the sort of primary peak that sits just on the outskirts of Hobart. Now, from door to peak, round trip, this adventure consisted of 14 miles and over 4,500 feet of elevation gain. So, needless to say, it was quite a feisty little endeavor that I did on multiple occasions while I was there in Hobart, but also one that I found to be quite worth the effort given the views from the top at the summit. Now, before leaving Tasmania to head back home, I found that I just had to satiate my appetite for the geographical oddities, specifically the geographical superlatives and all things remote. So I decided that an appropriate trek would be to see if I could get to the southernmost point of Tasmania, and therefore Australia. Now, to be completely fair, because I know someone's going to call me out on this, I do recognize that there are a few small islands off the coast of Tasmania that I was not about to swim to or rent a boat to, that are further south, as well as the sub-Antarctic island of Macquarie Island, which is even further south, and of course not counting the Antarctic stations that belong to Australia. So for all intents and purposes, the place that I was seeking out was the practical southernmost point of Australia. And maybe, just maybe, if I could get to that point, I would at least be able to visually see some of these islands offshore that actually mark places further south. After some sort of cursory reading online, I plotted a quick route down to a place called the Cape Bay Peninsula and the small little hamlet town of Cockle Creek, which incidentally is also home to the southernmost road in Australia. And what I saw was that this adventure was going to require about a 10-mile round-trip hike to reach the southernmost point on foot. In addition, if I actually wanted to make the true southern point of land, I was going to have to free hike through some pretty ridiculous looking wilderness that could potentially be unsafe and some wild terrain. But I still wanted to see if it was possible. So I figured I would go as far as I practically could, and I had no real idea if that final free hike would actually be feasible. So I picked up a rental car for the day in downtown Hobart, and after a 2-hour drive out of the city, I arrived at the Cockle Creek parking area, the southern tip of Tasmania. I registered my hiking intentions with the park office and began the 5-mile hike out to the South Cape Bay along the appropriately named South Coast Track. Now, there was some appropriate signage at the end of the parking area officially listing the road as the southernmost road in Australia, which was pretty cool. I got some photos of that. And the hike along the track was rolling and idyllic. The 5 miles went by sort of at a quick pace and felt effortless, and I really just felt good. It felt good to be out on this trail after a long week of sitting through conferences and seminars and workshops. Now, along the way, I did pass a handful of other hikers, but honestly, most of my memories of the trek are simply of a warm sun on my back and soft earth beneath my feet. Now, when I did break through and finally get to the exposed coastal cliffs at the end of the track and looked out over the ocean, I started to evaluate the feasibility of actually completing this backcountry free hike out to the tip of the southernmost peninsula. I spent quite a bit of time kind of doing the math in my head and debating the idea, but ultimately, after much deliberation And with notably waning daylight, I opted to forfeit the attempt as it just did not seem feasible. It looked quite dangerous, very unpleasant, and simply not worth the risk. Now, while I was standing there looking out at this peninsula, I had the realization that while I may not be standing on the practical southernmost point, I was still very likely the southernmost person in all of Australia, with the exception of maybe a few researchers down on Macquarie Island or at the Antarctic research stations. Now, standing from my vantage point at this rocky beach overlook, I also noticed that I was able to spot a very distant but also very uniquely shaped island far off out into the ocean. And after a quick glance at my reference maps, I realized that it was in fact the tiny and unpopulated Mewstone Island. Now, if you don't count those subantarctic islands I was talking about claimed by Australia, or the tiny 6-acre islet known as Pedra Branca, Mewstone is actually the southernmost point of Australia. Despite its rather diminutive size of only 30-some acres, Mewstone is a rather fascinating place, though. It has these really steep granite cliffs over 400 feet high, and I was able to spot it from over 50 miles away. So in short, witnessing Mewstone, the big sail jutting out from the water 50 miles away, from the southern Cockle Creek coast of the South Cape Bay of Tasmania, would sadly be the closest I would get to Australia's true southernmost point. But at the very least, I would earn the right to say that I drove on Australia's southernmost road, which in itself is a pretty cool thing to tout. Now, lastly, to end this post, I would say as I stood there at the trail terminus along the coast of Tasmania, imagining the entirety of the Australian population north of me and thinking about all these superlatives and spatial superlatives and altitudinal superlatives and cardinal superlatives and extreme points, it made me realize something that was oddly profound. And I spoke about this briefly earlier. During my deployment to South Pole Station, when I had walked out to take those pictures at the geographic South Pole, it never really occurred to me at those moments that while standing there at 90 degrees south, that I was the southernmost person on the entire surface of the planet, alive or dead, which is kind of bonkers. Literally, the entire population of the planet, all 8 billion people, were north of me. And it was a rather ridiculous realization to have as I stared out there at Mewstone Island while on the South Cape Bay. So eventually I did make the 5-mile hike back along the South Coast track to the Cockle Creek parking area, and then made the 2-hour drive back to Hobart. I returned my car, caught a bus to the airport, and began my long journey back to the States. And I found that the 14-hour flight back home wasn't as bad as I anticipated, as I came to realize that I actually had quite a bit to reflect on. So Tasmania and the Cockle Creek hike were truly another thrilling and profound trek to nowhere. So thank you everyone for following along as we talked about all sorts of goofy superlatives and we revisited my trek to the South Cape Bay of Tasmania. Thank you, take care, be safe. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye.